What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical American guy here today to learn and react to the War of 1812. The Canadian perspective, actually, is the title of this video. And I thought that was actually really cool and important that for this, during some of my recent videos, I've been learning about Canadian history, and something that stuck out during one of those videos, during the Canadian history explanation, was this War of 1812. I've heard of it, I've heard that name, but I'm sort of embarrassed to admit I don't know anything about that, and it was briefly explained as a conflict between the United States and what would be Canada, or was Canada, and I thought it deserved a more of a deep dive into it. And I think viewing this video in particular, the Canadian perspective, may lead to more of a interesting explanation that will explain to me exactly how it affected Canada and what, at the same time, what even this War of 1812 was all about, because I want to know. And I will find out. I will get answers. So, anyway, I digress. Let's check it out. Okay. The War of 1812. This is very dramatic. The colonies invaded. Yes.
We were the meat in the sandwich as far as this war was concerned. The war was between Great Britain and the United States.
I was just about to say, he can only be referring to Great Britain versus the United States, and then it was Canada that unfortunately got in the middle of it. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
But because the United States couldn't reach Great Britain, Canada was the stand-in.
Really? That's kind of ugly. That's kind of sad. So I'm assuming Americans were trying to go northward and attack what would be parts of Great Britain that were located in what is now Canada, and instead just ended up reaching, first and foremost, what would be Canadians on their way there. And then there was conflict. Which is, of course, horrible.
In Canada, it was an important war. It helped create a sense of Canadian identity. Indians, whites, British, French Canadians, American loyalists who had gone to Canada.
This is a good point. I mean, it's very sad that is how it had to happen. But I understand that certainly in times of war, that causes a nation, people, to come together in, for survival and to find more of a sense of identity. Sadly, through the vessel of war, but nonetheless, that's how it happened. That's unfortunately how it happened. So that does make sense that this ultimately helped shape Canada in some ways.
People who you might have thought wouldn't have gelled very well all came together to help repel the American invasion of Canada.
Okay.
And that created...
That is very inspiring how, just as this historian is saying, people from all different walks of life, different cultures, nationalities, came together as Canadians to stop this threat. That's very cool.
To some extent anyway, a sense of a Canadian identity and a Canadian destiny that was separate from the United States.
Yeah. I mean, I also want to know how this thing ended up ending, and sort of, how this might have influenced when America did have more conflict with the UK post the War of 1812, what the relationship of Canada and America was at that point. probably not very good.
For Canada, the lands and the freedoms that the people had worked so hard to preserve were still theirs. There was a greater sense of belonging and allegiance. People knew that they had fought for this, and they felt a sense of cohesiveness. So that there was more of I think, an even greater sense of loyalty.
Yeah, it's funny how that all works, because Americans would say the same of the American Revolution, fighting for their independence from Great Britain, united Americans in a similar way that the War of 1812 helped unite a lot of Canadians.
If you look at this from the Canadian viewpoint, the United States waged war for 2.5 years against a country that was absolutely no threat to it.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. I haven't even touched on that part of this. Why? Why are we attacking Canada? Canadians? The Canadian people? Why are we doing this? This makes no sense to me.
Launched a dozen or so invasions against Lower and Upper Canada, burned towns and villages, and ruined the economy.
It was a watershed because people who visited the Canadas in the 1820s certainly refer many instances of talking to those who said before the war or after the war. They measured most things by the War of 1812 as a kind of sort of marker.
Wow.
Which indeed it was.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, significant event. And they're not touching too much on the America's motivation going into this. Maybe because we're getting the Canadian perspective here, not the American perspective. I'm sure if I was watching an American perspective of this, it would have all sorts of excuses and rationale and reasons for, oh, this is why we did it. It totally made sense. But then that would be bias, obviously. So I am glad I'm watching this video, because I feel like it's the side of history that I am much more interested in and that I'm least familiar with. I'm guessing America broadly may have attacked, basically thinking, oh, they're part of the UK empire and therefore our enemy, or they are getting between us and our enemy, and or something like that. Don't quote me on that. I can't exactly say, but that would be what I would think.
In leading to the process which 50 years later, in 1867, gave Canada its nationhood.
I didn't realize that this was such a historically important event in the nation building of Canada, in forging Canada, uniting it closer together. I never realized that, never appreciated that, if you will. Region, culture, and language.
When the Americans came to Canada, and they did call the people up here Canadians, they
Okay.
probably didn't understand there were certain cultural nuances that you had a huge block of French Canadian Catholics in Quebec, but you also had a strong element of loyalist settlers who had left the new United States at the end of the Revolutionary War.
Okay, yes, I was wondering about this. If at this point in history, because God knows I'm not good at remembering these dates or anything, I don't claim to be good at remembering. At this point in time, they were already being referred to as Canadians.
And they weren't sure what was going to happen if the Americans took over the Canada. Whereas with the British, they sort of knew where they were going.
Oh, so that's an interesting point. So Canada really was between, oh my gosh, two hard places, trying to be independent of Great Britain while trying to be independent of the United States. And both are just pounding on either side of this. And Canada kinda, since they were under British rule for a long time, they kind of knew what that looked like. But there was also the worry, and then there's the worry of, oh, if the Americans succeed in this, what's that going to look like, being part of America? So, I don't know. Very interesting what could have been.
And the British also did a pretty good job spinning the fact that if the U.S. took over all of Canada, that it would be a threat to not only their culture and their language, but also to their religion.
Yeah. Did the UK and Canada worked together to repel America in the War of 1812? Did that have some part of their success? What I assume was success, because thankfully America did not indeed take over Canada.
The language rights also were very important, and that was one factor. Another factor would have been questions with regards to the rights that they already enjoyed under the British regime, including parliamentary democracy. And, in 1812, women could vote.
Yeah, I can absolutely see now why Canada did not want anything to do with being part of America. They were establishing themselves as kind of their own identity more and more. They were in a good place. They were getting to a better and better place under the influence of the United Kingdom. So that makes total sense.
In Quebec province.
The idea of an American invasion was seen as a threat to their language, their religion, their culture.
Yeah.
And they put up a pretty good fight.
Oh, I'm sure it was a legitimate threat to Canadian culture and language. If America 200 years ago had successfully won this war of 1812, I'm sure it would have imparted its culture onto Canada and absorbed it into part of America. If they could make that happen, I'm sure it would happen. So yeah, essentially Canada was fighting for the survival of its nation, its culture. Everything that is Canada was at stake. So that's really kind of scary and interesting to think about how that almost happened.
Through the War of 1812.
Founding myths and heroes. Okay.
I think over a long period of time, the Canadians gained something from this because it became part of our founding history. There was a unifying incident that people were able to coalesce around.
Yeah. At least there was that.
A founding history that you can teach that will unify people.
Yeah.
This goes on to this day. Da Salaberry is still in the school books. Every town in Quebec has a Salaberry Street somewhere and a Châteauguay Street in another place.
Huh. I don't know what those terms mean, actually.
Salaberry is still in the school books. Every town in Quebec has a Salaberry Street somewhere.
Salaberry Street? What does this mean? Salaberry Street? Google, please. No, not salivary glands. No. Please, Canada. Oh my goodness, I'm spelling it wrong. I'm spelling it wrong.
And a Châteauguay Street in another place.
Shadowgate? Shadow... Gate? Ah, dang it. I don't think I'm going to be able to figure this one out. But somehow these two things were important during the War of 1812, and to this day, streets are named after these two names in remembrance of how important the War of 1812 is. That much I can deduce, thankfully.
Da Salaberry is still in the school books. Every town in Quebec has a Salaberry Street somewhere and a Châteauguay Street in another place.
Maybe they're names of people that I missed? Apologies.
Loris Secord, Isaac Brock, Tecumseh. We've taken on these people as our national heroes.
Oh, yes. Okay, that's what the name of this section was. Talking about heroes of the war. I see. So yes, Canada does indeed have streets named after these heroes, these historical figures.
And all three of those people have something in common. None of them were born in Canada. And probably only one of them might have defined herself as a Canadian. But the other two certainly wouldn't have.
Canada at the time was British North America. A Canadian at the time would consider a British regular soldier one of their soldiers.
Right.
That attitude continued on in the Canadian psyche. So it becomes Canadians beat the Americans at Kreiser's Farm. Canadians beat.
Oh, so whenever there was Canadian or UK, British victory in battle during this time period in North America, where they defeated, either of them defeated the Americans, it was just more pride for Canada. Canada could take credit in that and pride in that. Those are our people. That makes sense.
The Americans at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Canadians captured Detroit. Canadians burnt the White House, but the British lost.
What? They did? They did? When? What? I didn't know. I didn't know this. Canadians, did you burn the White House down? Why'd you do that? Well, I guess we started a war with you, so fair is fair.
It's the Battle of New Orleans.
Oh, I think that's it. Okay, no, that was a good video by Buffalo Toronto Public Media. Thank you. I'll give you a like. Yes, that was very helpful, very enlightening. I liked the Canadian perspective of it all, explaining exactly how much the War of 1812 meant to Canada and what it meant to its survival. This is certainly not something that is taught or discussed in great detail in American history education. And I can see why. It was America being violent, overextending its reach, attacking people who didn't deserve to be attacked, and ultimately we were defeated. So on all accounts, it is just kind of a dark spot in American history. So I can see why we don't really talk about it, get taught about it, but I think it's important to learn about these things. It certainly is very important. And I mean, learning about all of Canadian history, I still think is silly how little Americans know about Canada. We're literally right next to each other. We live side by side harmoniously, if I am using that word correctly. I can be a little poetic from time to time, as you can see. But anyway, before I get carried away, I did enjoy this. It did enlighten me about how important this war was. So very good, very interesting. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this reaction, feel free to give it a like or a comment. And if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to Canadian history and culture, ideas, things I don't know, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.